Gospel according to St. John, the 11th chapter. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus.
Lord, he whom you love is ill.
But when Jesus heard it, he said,
This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.
Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples,
Let us go to Judea again.
The disciples said to him,
Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you. And are you going there again?
Jesus answered,
Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them.
After saying this, he told them,
Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him.
The disciples said to him,
Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right.
Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly,
Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.
Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples,
Let us also go, that we may die with him.
When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus,
Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him.
Jesus said to her,
Your brother will rise again.
Martha said to him,
I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day.
Jesus said to her,
I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?
She said to him,
Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world.
When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately.
The teacher is here and is calling for you.
And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him,
Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said,
Where have you laid him?
They said to him,
Lord, come and see.
and Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said,
See how he loved her.
but some of them said,
Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?
Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said,
Take away the stone.
Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him,
Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead for 4 days.
Jesus said to her,
Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?
So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said,
Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me.
When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice,
Lazarus, come out.
The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them,
Unbind him and let him go.
Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Lord. There are some things in parenthood that you you don't take into account when you're contemplating having children, right? The things that you, at least I thought about was, was I ever going to sleep through the night again? And then, I began to think about, I'm going to have to teach them how to read. And as they grew up, I worried about teaching them to drive. I worried about how they do in their baseball game. I worried about whether or not they would take drugs. But as I was thinking about having children, I knew I was going to be doing all of those things. Those are all things I foresaw in my future. But one of the things that I didn't think about when I was going to have children was the thought of digging graves. If you are a parent and you haven't dug a grave to date, then I can only imagine that somehow by the grace of God, you have been spared Goldie the goldfish, and Hermie the hermit crab, and Humphrey the hamster. All those pets that when you go to the pet store, they get home and then 3 weeks later they're dead and there you are in the garden digging a grave. Well, I'm one of those moms who has let their children have just about every pet known to humankind. We have had fish and hermit crabs and guinea pigs and cats and dogs and even lizards. And every single one of those pets that we've had, no matter how small or tiny or seemingly inconsequential, my children have loved every single one fiercely. So all those little graves that I dug, I remember every single one of them. But one grave that I remember holding out the most was for a lizard named Stripe. And it was Easter Sunday, 2009. It was a beautiful, you may not remember this Sunday, but I do. It was a beautiful, glorious Sunday. And we had spent the day in church and then, hunting for Easter eggs and having our family meal, all those things that make that day so rich and full. So by the end of the day, all of us were just ready to fall into bed from exhaustion. Well, as I tucked Jackson in, I checked on his lizard, Stripe. I checked on Stripe. And we had been, this is also something that you don't sign up for as a parent, we had been nursing Stripe the lizard with a syringe, fortified with medicine and food because Stripe was sick. Well, as soon as I checked on him, I knew that something was wrong because Stripe was cold and stiff, and I was getting ready to tuck Jackson into bed. So what to do now? I couldn't have him wake up in the morning by himself and find the lizard. So I told him. And you can imagine the sobbing that then ensued. So we had no choice. He and his brothers and I, we all traipsed out to the garden to plan a little unplanned funeral. And as we walked to the garden, we went out our back glass doors. As we walked to the garden, Jackson says to me in his little 9-year-old voice at the time, Stripe died on the same day that Jesus came back to life. And my heart ached more than I thought possible for this little tiny gecko. And I really didn't know what to say. I just said, I'm pretty sure I just said, "Oh, Jackson." And in reality, in truth, the only thing that had died that day was that lizard. But I felt like this piece of me died in that moment when I had to sort of comfort my child because I didn't know what to do. But Jackson, if you've ever met Jackson, he is this sort of little tiny prophet in his own right. And he sort of prophesied to me. And he said to me, "But at least we know that Stripe is with God now." And I thought, oh yes, at least we know that. And we could pick it apart theologically or whatever, but it didn't matter because those words at that moment felt like life to me. They felt like breath. Not because I mourned the life of the gecko at all and I needed Stripe to be in heaven, but because of how much my heart ached for Jackson, how I worried about his loss of innocence, and I worried about what this moment was going to do for him. And I worried about what died in him that day. So as he knelt on the cold, I mean, it's dark out, and he kneels on the cold, dark earth, and he bows his head over this little gecko, I couldn't stop crying. But I cried not for his pain, but mostly because of the natural ability he had to cling to hope. He knew, he trusted that Stripe was with God, and that was enough for him to step forward. Ezekiel, he also paints this rich picture of what a graveyard looks like. And his words that he paints are so prophetic that we have been talking about this valley of dry bones for 3,000 years. As a preacher, I can't help but feel a little bit jealous, because I'm certain that in 3,000 years, nobody is going to be talking about what I wrote, or what I said, or what I prophesied. Although, I think I've got a better gig, because Ezekiel had a bunch of dry bones in a graveyard, right? And I've got you all. But I think the reason his vision has survived for so very long is because in reality, we all know what he's talking about. Deep in our own bones, we know this reality of death. But the reality of death that Ezekiel is concerned with isn't death and life like we traditionally think about it. Ezekiel is concerned with despair and hope. Because the living people that Ezekiel is prophesying to, they've died before it's their time. Cut off from hope, they feel as if they can't possibly live. They are as good as dead. They might as well get a shovel and start covering themselves with piles of dirt. That night when I covered that lizard, it was a very small body of bones we buried. And it was a very small graveyard we stood in. But this week, as I thought about Ezekiel's vision, I realized that it doesn't matter how big the graveyard is, or how many bones there are. What matters is what happens in the graveyard. And we can hunker down in our tombs, and we can be petrified by fear, let calcification sort of set into our hearts, and our bodies become stripped with purpose, as our tongues stick to our mouths because our hope is dried out. We can cry, our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost, and we are cut off from God. And if we do that, when we do that, we will see Jesus weeping. Not so much for Lazarus, but for our inability to see beyond the graves that we dig. He weeps because we're unable to see that life actually lies before us right now. Come out. That's what he says. And sometimes we can't. Even after our bones are put back together, even after they stand, even after they speak, the bones still stay in the graves. Holding our breath, we're afraid of what lies beyond the grave. Remember Stripe the lizard? In that story, where was the point of resurrection? Because the point of resurrection wasn't in a tiny lizard body. It was in a 9-year-old boy who knew that he had a whole life ahead of him, despite the fact that he lost his very best friend. And it was in a frazzled mother who wanted nothing more than to protect her child. The point of the resurrection was in the living. The point of the resurrection was in the words that Jackson spoke when he spoke hope into the world. Somewhere along the lines, the Israelites began to think that there was no hope, that God had forgotten them, that God lived only in Israel and not in the exile. They began to think that God was someplace else, and that God was most certainly not in the wilderness, and was most certainly not in the desert, and God was most certainly not in the grave. They came to believe that they had to get someplace else in order to be near to God. And that feeling of hopelessness and helplessness was suffocating. The other day, I met with a pastor from a very fundamental church about some theological differences, which a whole different story in and of itself. But I knew it was going to be a difficult conversation. And I was prepared for the difficult conversation. But there was one moment where I said to my friend that went with me, I cannot do this. Because there was this giant magnet plastered on the side of the van, and it said, "Where are you headed? Heaven or hell?" And as soon as I saw that, I knew that he wasn't going to be able to hear a word that I had to say. And for the most part, that's probably true. But the other night, as I sat thinking about the exiles, and I started thinking about how they thought that God was some other place, and about how sometimes we think that too, I realized that there was one thing, out of all the things I said to that pastor, there was one thing that I didn't say to him. Breathe. God is that close to you. You don't have to get to heaven in order for the resurrection to begin. See, God gives them and gives us the promise that only God can give. I will make breath enter you, and you shall live. God says, breathe. I'm this close, as close as your own breath. Inhale and exhale. You can do it. Inhale and exhale. That close. That present. Despite any fears that God is far away or somewhere else or has forgotten about you, the resurrection is right now. Inhale. Exhale. And step out of whatever grave is swallowing you. I feel like we ponder, I know, we back in B. Seeker Hall, we ponder the resurrection a lot. So I feel a little silly saying to you, breathe. That's the resurrection. And then I do it. And you feel the breath of God enter you. And something about that is so true. That when you can breathe in hope, that's from God. And when you breathe in love, that is from God. And breathing in forgiveness, that is from God. And I need God to put it in me. And when he does, that's life. I don't know if I had told that pastor the other day to breathe, if it would have been a mini resurrection for him. I seriously doubt it. I remember how the conversation went. But I can't help but wish that he knew that, and that his wife knew that, and the little children that were running around knew it, and that his congregation knew it. So I hope beyond hope that today you can trust that because God is present here and now, that every time you breathe, you stand ready looking for the future, looking forward in hope that the resurrection begins now, here and now.